When a wealthy black CEO visits a small town, he faces blatant racism from the local sheriff, who humiliates him in a shocking abuse of power. What begins as a routine encounter escalates into a public spectacle, with the sheriff weaponizing racial bias to assert dominance. The CEO's calm demeanor contrasts sharply with the sheriff's hostility, exposing the infuriating depths of systemic racism in America. As tensions rise and secrets surface, the community is forced to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and corruption. This gripping story explores injustice, resilience, and the fight for dignity in the face of discrimination. The warm afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Maple Creek, a small, picturesque town nestled in the heart of the Midwest. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know each other, and strangers were met with wary glances. The quiet streets were lined with charming colonial-style homes, their pristine facades a testament to the town's insistence on maintaining its image of perfection. But beneath the surface of this postcard-worthy community, there were cracks, deep ones, that few acknowledged. Dr. Ayanna Bennett stepped out of her sleek black SUV, her heels clicking softly against the cobblestone pavement of Main Street. In her mid-30s, Ayanna exuded confidence and poise. She was a highly respected surgeon, known for her groundbreaking work in underserved communities, and the founder of a nonprofit dedicated to improving healthcare access for marginalized groups. Today, however, Ayanna wasn't here as a celebrated figure. She was here as an outsider, hoping to bring change to a town that seemed stuck in another era. Ayanna adjusted her blazer and glanced up at the old brick hospital in front of her. It was Maple Creek General, a facility that had been on the brink of closure for years. Its outdated equipment and dwindling staff made it more of a relic than a beacon of healthcare. Still, Ayanna saw potential in it. Her nonprofit had recently secured funding to revitalize struggling hospitals in rural areas, and Maple Creek General was at the top of her list. She entered the hospital lobby, greeted by the faint smell of antiseptic and the distant hum of a vending machine. A nurse at the front desk looked up, her expression polite but reserved. "Good afternoon," Ayanna said warmly. "I'm Dr. Ayanna Bennett. I have a meeting with the hospital administrator, Mr. Jeffries." The nurse's eyes flickered with surprise, though she quickly masked it. "Of course, Dr. Bennett, please have a seat. I'll let him know you're here." Ayanna smiled and took a seat in the waiting area. As she waited, she couldn't help but notice the stares from some of the staff passing by. It was subtle, lingering glances, whispered conversations, but she'd experienced it enough times to recognize it. The sharp contrast between her tailored suit and the town's modest, conservative atmosphere didn't help her blend in. Neither did her presence as a successful black woman in a place that was overwhelmingly white. Her thoughts were interrupted when a man in his early 50s stepped out of the office. He was tall and wiry, with thinning hair and a suit that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. His smile was tight, his handshake perfunctory. "Dr. Bennett," he said, his voice brisk. "I'm Greg Jeffries, the hospital administrator. Thank you for coming." "Thank you for having me," Ayanna replied, matching his professional tone. "I'm excited to discuss the revitalization project and how we can collaborate to bring Maple Creek General back to its full potential." Jeffries nodded but didn't respond right away. Instead, he gestured for her to follow him into his office. The space was cramped, with papers stacked haphazardly on the desk and walls adorned with outdated medical certificates. He motioned for her to sit, before taking a seat behind the desk. "So," Jeffries began, clasping his hands together, "your organization is offering a significant amount of funding, which, I'll admit, the hospital desperately needs. But I have to ask, why Maple Creek? What's your angle?" Ayanna raised an eyebrow at the question, but maintained her composure. "There's no angle, Mr. Jeffries. My nonprofit focuses on bringing resources to communities in need. Maple Creek General has been struggling for years, and we believe it's a prime candidate for revitalization. My goal is to improve healthcare access for your residents. Nothing more, nothing less." Jeffries leaned back in his chair, scrutinizing her. "I see. Well, I won't sugarcoat it, Dr. Bennett. Maple Creek is a tight-knit community. We're not exactly used to outsiders coming in and making changes." Ayanna caught the subtle emphasis on outsiders. It wasn't the first time she'd heard such a sentiment, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Still, she refused to let it rattle her. "I understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Change can be difficult, but it's necessary. If we work together, we can ensure that this hospital not only survives, but thrives, that benefits everyone." Jeffries nodded slowly, though his expression remained unreadable. "I'll take that under consideration. For now, I'd like to show you around the facility." Ayanna followed him, as he led her through the hospital's dimly lit hallways. The signs of neglect were everywhere. Peeling paint, flickering lights, and equipment that looked like it hadn't been used since the early 2000s. She took mental notes, already formulating a plan for upgrades and repairs. As they passed the staff break room, a group of nurses and technicians fell silent, their eyes darting toward Ayanna. One of them, a young man with a name tag that read Kyle, leaned toward his coworker and whispered, though not quietly enough to avoid being overheard, "Who's she supposed to be? Another consultant coming to tell us how to do our jobs?" Ayanna didn't react, though the comment stung. She'd faced skepticism before, especially in communities where her presence challenged long-standing norms. Still, she reminded herself of her purpose. This wasn't about her, it was about making a difference. Jeffries didn't seem to notice the comment, or chose to ignore it. He continued the tour, pointing out various departments and their deficiencies. By the time they returned to his office, Ayanna was more determined than ever to move forward with the project. "Thank you for the tour," she said, as they sat back down. "I can see there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm confident we can turn this around. I'll be sending over a detailed proposal in the next few days." Jeffries nodded, though his hesitation was palpable. "I appreciate that, Dr. Bennett, but I'll need to discuss this with the board before we make any decisions. As I said, Maple Creek is a close-knit town, and changes like these require careful consideration." Ayanna smiled politely, though she knew careful consideration was often code for resistance. "Of course, I'll look forward to hearing from you." As she left the hospital, Ayanna's mind was already racing with ideas. She knew this wouldn't be easy, change never was. But she was prepared to face whatever challenges came her way. What she didn't know was just how deep the resistance in Maple Creek ran, and how far some would go to maintain the status quo. The small town of Elmswood sat nestled between rolling hills and dense pine forests, its streets lined with quaint shops and weathered brick buildings that whispered of another era. It was a place where time seemed to move more slowly, where everyone claimed to know everyone else, and where newcomers were met with wary, sidelong glances. Beneath its charming facade, however, lay an undercurrent of unspoken rules and deeply ingrained divisions, a stark contrast to the warm welcome its brochures boasted. Xavier Shaw parked his modest navy blue sedan outside the Elmswood Cafe, the engine purring softly before falling silent. Dressed in a crisp, well-fitted gray suit with no tie, he adjusted his cuffs and glanced at the cafe's weathered sign, swaying gently in the breeze. To most passers-by, Xavier would seem like an ordinary man, a visitor stopping for a coffee on his way through town. What they wouldn't guess was that he was the CEO of Shaw Enterprises, a multi-million-dollar technology firm based in New York. Nor would they guess that this same man had quietly funneled millions into programs supporting underserved communities across the country. Xavier didn't carry himself with the swagger often associated with wealth. His gait was steady, his demeanor approachable, and his smile warm, yet reserved. Despite his accomplishments, he preferred simplicity, a trait he attributed to his late grandmother, who had raised him in a modest home on the outskirts of Atlanta. "Stay humble, Xavier," she used to say. "Let your actions, not your title, speak for you." He stepped inside the cafe, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries wrapping around him like a familiar embrace. The place was charming in its simplicity. Mismatched wooden chairs, checkered tablecloths, and walls adorned with faded photos of Elmswood from decades past. The morning crowd buzzed with quiet conversation, punctuated by the occasional clink of ceramic cups. Xavier approached the counter, where a young barista with curly red hair and freckles greeted him with a bright smile. "Good morning. What can I get for you?" "Just a black coffee, please," Xavier said, his voice smooth and calm. The barista nodded and turned to prepare his drink, leaving Xavier to glance around the cafe. His gaze landed on a corner table where a group of older men sat hunched over their newspapers, their conversations audible in bits and pieces. "Ain't right. The way they're trying to change everything around here." "Yeah, and it's folks from out of town, thinking they know better than us." Xavier recognized the tone. It was the same resistance he'd encountered in other small towns when he'd tried to introduce change. He turned back to the counter as the barista placed his coffee in front of him. "That'll be $2, she said, her smile unwavering. Xavier handed her a $10 bill and waved off the change. "Keep it." "Thank you," she replied, her face lighting up. As Xavier moved toward a vacant table by the window, the door swung open, and a man in a sheriff's uniform strode in. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years of authority. The room seemed to shift slightly, conversations lowering to murmurs as the sheriff surveyed the space. His gaze landed on Xavier, lingering just a moment too long before he turned toward the counter. "Sheriff Grayson?" The barista greeted him cheerfully. "The usual?" "Yup," he said gruffly, his eyes briefly darting back to Xavier. Xavier settled into his seat, taking a sip of his coffee. He had grown accustomed to moments like this, silent judgments that hung in the air like smoke. Though he could usually brush them off, something about Sheriff Grayson's gaze stirred a flicker of unease. The sheriff's drink was ready in minutes, and as he turned to leave, he made a point of walking past Xavier's table. He stopped briefly, his shadow casting a long shape across the floor. "Morning," the sheriff said, his tone neutral, but his expression unreadable. "Good morning," Xavier replied, meeting the sheriff's eyes with calm confidence. There was a pause, the kind that carried an unspoken challenge. Then the sheriff nodded curtly and left the cafe, the door jangling behind him. Xavier exhaled, his grip tightening slightly on his coffee cup. Encounters like this were a reminder of how his presence could unsettle certain spaces, no matter how unassuming he tried to be. But he hadn't come to Elmswood for comfort. He'd come to address a problem. He pulled out his phone and opened an email from his assistant, detailing the agenda for his day. The main item was a meeting with the Elmswood Town Council to discuss a proposal for expanding Shaw Enterprises' community outreach programs into rural areas. The plan included funding for job training, infrastructure improvements, and scholarships for local students. All initiatives Xavier had seen transform other struggling towns. But he knew convincing Elmswood's leadership wouldn't be easy. As he finished his coffee, Xavier noticed a waitress clearing tables nearby. She was in her late 20s, with tired eyes and a nervous energy that suggested she was trying to keep up with too much at once. A glass slipped from her tray and shattered on the floor, drawing the attention of several customers. The woman froze, her face flushing crimson. "Don't just stand there, clean it up," snapped an older man sitting nearby, his tone harsh and dismissive. Xavier stood up, grabbing a napkin from his table. He crouched down to help the waitress, who looked at him in surprise. "You don't have to do that," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's no trouble," Xavier said, his tone reassuring. Together, they gathered the shards of glass, and he handed her the napkin to mop up the spill. The older man who had spoken earlier muttered something under his breath, loud enough for Xavier to catch the words. "Some people don't know their place." Xavier glanced up at the man, his expression steady but unreadable. He held the man's gaze for a long moment before turning back to the waitress with a gentle smile. "Take care," he said quietly, standing and placing a few extra bills on the counter before leaving the cafe. As Xavier stepped outside, the crisp morning air greeted him, carrying with it the weight of the day ahead. He knew the path he'd chosen wouldn't be easy. In towns like Elmswood, resistance to change often ran deep, and the battle for progress could feel like an uphill climb. But Xavier also knew that progress was worth the fight, and he wasn't one to back down. Xavier Shaw adjusted his tie as he stepped into the Elmswood Town Hall, its grand yet slightly decrepit facade standing as a testament to its age and the town's reluctance to change inside. The atmosphere was a mix of muted colors and the faint smell of old paper. A secretary at the front desk gave him a once-over, her eyes narrowing briefly before she returned to her work. "Good morning," Xavier said, his voice even. "I'm here for the council meeting." The secretary didn't look up. "Name?" she asked curtly, her fingers poised over the keyboard. "Xavier Shaw." Her fingers paused, and she glanced up at him, skepticism clear in her gaze. "You're here for the council meeting?" "That's correct," Xavier replied with a polite nod. For a moment, she seemed to weigh his words, her eyes flicking over his tailored suit and briefcase. Then she sighed and gestured toward a small waiting area. "Take a seat, they'll call you when they're ready." Xavier thanked her and moved to the designated area, his calm demeanor betraying none of the irritation that simmered beneath the surface. He sat down on a worn leather chair, pulling out his phone to review the presentation he had meticulously prepared. He had dealt with subtle dismissals like this before, but it never failed to sting, a silent reminder of the assumptions some people made before he even opened his mouth. After a few minutes, the double doors leading to the council chamber opened, and a stocky man in a tan blazer stepped out. His name tag read Thomas Grady, and the smug expression on his face matched the condescending tone of his voice. "Mr. Shaw," he called, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Xavier. A brief flicker of surprise crossed his face, as if he hadn't expected Xavier to match the name. "Yes," Xavier replied, standing and extending his hand. Thomas hesitated just a fraction too long before shaking it. "Right this way." The council chamber was a modest room with a semicircular table at the front, where 5 members of the town council sat. Their expressions ranged from neutral to openly skeptical as Xavier entered. He walked to the podium at the center of the room, setting his briefcase on the wooden surface. "Good morning, council members," Xavier began, his voice steady and confident. "Thank you for allowing me to present today. I'm here to discuss an initiative that I believe could benefit Elmswood in significant ways." He clicked a button on his remote, and the screen behind him lit up with a slide detailing Shaw Enterprises' proposed outreach program. He spoke with practiced ease, outlining plans for job training centers, scholarships for local youth, and investments in infrastructure, all designed to uplift the community without displacing its residents. As Xavier spoke, he noticed the subtle cues. The way Councilman Grady leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a faint smirk on his lips. The way Councilwoman Harris tapped her pen against her notebook, her eyes glazing over, as if she'd already made up her mind. Only one member, a younger man named Ethan Morris, seemed engaged, nodding occasionally as he jotted down notes. When Xavier finished, he looked around the room, his gaze steady. "I'm happy to answer any questions you might have." Councilman Grady was the first to speak. "Mr. Shaw, this all sounds very ambitious," he said, drawing out the word as though it were a veiled insult. "But I'm curious. What's in it for you?" Xavier met Grady's gaze without flinching. "What's in it for me is the satisfaction of seeing communities thrive. My company has implemented similar programs in other towns with great success, and we've seen firsthand how these initiatives can transform lives." Grady chuckled, the sound low and dismissive. "Transform lives, huh? And you're sure this isn't just a PR stunt, a way to make your company look good?" The insinuation hung in the air, and Xavier felt a flicker of anger rise within him. He took a steadying breath. "This is about creating opportunities for people who need them most. My track record speaks for itself, Councilman." Councilwoman Harris leaned forward, her expression skeptical. "You mentioned scholarships and job training. Are you planning to prioritize locals for these opportunities, or will this program bring in outsiders?" "Locals will absolutely be prioritized," Xavier replied. "The goal is to invest in the people who are already here, helping them build a brighter future." The council exchanged glances, and Xavier could sense the undercurrent of resistance. He had seen it before, the fear of change, disguised as concern for tradition. He knew they weren't just questioning his proposal, they were questioning him. Councilwoman Harris's next question confirmed it. "Mr. Shaw, with all due respect, have you spent much time in small towns like ours? Elmswood has a unique culture, and I'm not sure an outsider could fully understand our needs." Xavier's jaw tightened. He kept his voice calm. "I grew up in a small town not unlike Elmswood. I know what it's like to feel overlooked, to want more opportunities, but not have access to them. That's why I'm here, to ensure that the people of Elmswood have the resources they need to succeed." Councilman Grady's smirk deepened. "Well, it's certainly an impressive pitch, but we'll need time to review this further. You understand, of course?" The meeting concluded shortly after, with vague promises to follow up that Xavier knew were little more than polite dismissals. As he packed up his materials, Ethan Morris approached him. "Mr. Shaw," he said, extending his hand. I think what you're proposing has real potential. I'll do what I can to push this forward. Thank you, Mr. Morris, Xavier said, appreciating the genuine support. I hope we can work together to make this happen. As Xavier left the town hall, the crisp air did little to cool the frustration simmering inside him. The council's resistance was rooted in more than just skepticism. It was a refusal to see beyond their preconceived notions of him and what he represented. Outside the town hall. On the steps of the building, Xavier's path was blocked by none other than Sheriff Grayson. The man's stance was casual, but his eyes held a glint of challenge. "Busy day, Mr. Shaw?" Grayson asked, his tone laced with false friendliness. "Indeed," Xavier replied, his expression neutral. "Anything I can help you with, Sheriff?" Grayson chuckled, the sound low and condescending. "Just making sure you're finding your way around Elmswood's a small town. People here value tradition." "Tradition is important," Xavier said evenly, "but progress and tradition don't have to be mutually exclusive." Grayson's smile tightened. "Just remember, not everyone's eager for change." Xavier met the sheriff's gaze, his calm exterior masking the growing frustration within him. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff. Have a good day." As Xavier walked to his car, he felt the weight of Grayson's gaze on his back. He knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but Xavier Shaw wasn't one to back down. The following week, Xavier Shaw returned to Elmswood for a follow-up meeting, only to find that the stakes had been raised far beyond his expectations. The air in the town felt heavier, and as he approached the town hall, he noticed a group of protesters gathered outside. Their signs bore slogans like, "Protect Elmswood's heritage," and "No outsiders needed," a clear indication of resistance to his proposed initiatives. As he stepped out of his car, a small group of reporters swarmed him, cameras flashing and microphones thrust in his direction. "Mr. Shaw, what do you have to say about claims that your program will disrupt the fabric of this community? Some residents say your plans will bring in outsiders and ruin the town's culture. How do you respond?" Xavier held his composure, even as the questions jabbed at him like daggers. "My program is designed to benefit Elmswood residents, focusing on job creation, education, and infrastructure improvements. It's about building opportunities for the people who call this town home." Before he could say more, Sheriff Grayson appeared at the top of the town hall steps, his booming voice cutting through the chaos. "All right, that's enough. Let the man through." The reporters parted reluctantly, their lenses still trained on Xavier. As he climbed the steps, Grayson greeted him with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Busy morning, Mr. Shaw?" "Seems that way, Sheriff," Xavier replied, his tone measured. "I appreciate your intervention." Grayson's smile widened, though it carried no warmth. "Just doing my job." As Xavier entered the council chamber, he was met with a palpable tension. The council members were already seated, their expressions ranging from indifferent to openly hostile. Councilman Grady, in particular, wore a smirk that set Xavier on edge. "We've received quite a bit of feedback since your last visit," Grady began, his voice dripping with condescension. "It seems your proposal has stirred up some concerns among our residents." Xavier nodded, refusing to let Grady's tone rattle him. "I understand that change can be difficult, but I believe these initiatives will bring long-term benefits to Elmswood." Grady leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "That may be, but this town values its traditions. We're not sure your vision aligns with what our community wants." Before Xavier could respond, Councilwoman Harris chimed in. "We've also received reports that your company has faced criticism in other towns, claims of overreach, disrupting local economies." "That's categorically false," Xavier interjected, his voice firm but calm. "My company's track record speaks for itself. We prioritize community input and collaboration in every project." Ethan Morris, the lone supportive voice on the council, spoke up. "I've reviewed Shaw Enterprises' work in other towns, and I believe this program could be a game-changer for Elmswood. We should give it a fair shot." Grady shot Ethan a withering look. "Your enthusiasm is noted, Mr. Morris, but this isn't just about economics, it's about preserving the character of our town." The debate continued, with Xavier calmly addressing each point of contention, even as the council's resistance became increasingly apparent. It was clear that Grady and Harris were more interested in preserving their own influence than considering the merits of his proposal. After the meeting, Xavier exited the town hall to find that the protest had grown larger and more aggressive. A man in the crowd shouted, "We don't need your kind here." While others jeered and waved their signs, Xavier kept his head high, but the weight of their hostility pressed down on him. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the edge of the crowd. Xavier turned to see a young black man, no older than 20, being shoved by a group of protesters. The man raised his hands defensively, but the situation quickly escalated as one of the protesters threw a punch. "Hey!" Xavier shouted, stepping toward the chaos. "Stop this!" Before he could reach the young man, Sheriff Grayson intervened, not to stop the aggressors, but to grab the young man by the arm. "You're coming with me," Grayson growled, dragging him toward a squad car. "For what?" the young man protested. "I didn't do anything." "Disturbing the peace," Grayson snapped. "Now get in the car." Xavier felt his blood boil. "Sheriff Grayson, that's enough. I saw what happened. He was defending himself." Grayson turned, his eyes narrowing. "Stay out of this, Mr. Shaw. This doesn't concern you." "It concerns me when an innocent man is being targeted," Xavier said, his voice steady, despite the anger coursing through him. Grayson stepped closer, his posture threatening. "Careful, Mr. Shaw. You're not in charge here." The tension between them crackled like a live wire. Xavier knew that pushing further could make things worse, but he couldn't stand by and do nothing. "Take me instead," Xavier said, his voice calm but resolute. "If you need to make an arrest, arrest me." Grayson's eyes flickered with surprise, then something darker. He seemed to relish the opportunity. "Fine, turn around?" As Grayson cuffed him, Xavier caught the young man's gaze and gave him a reassuring nod. "You'll be okay," he said softly. The small, dimly lit cell was a far cry from Xavier's usual surroundings, but he sat with his back straight and his head held high. He knew the arrest was a calculated move, a way to humiliate him and send a message, but he also knew it would backfire. Word of his arrest spread quickly, and within hours, a crowd had gathered outside the jail. Among them was Ethan Morris, who stormed into the sheriff's office demanding an explanation. "This is unacceptable," Ethan said, his voice sharp. "You arrested an innocent man, and you're holding him without cause." Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression smug. "Mr. Shaw interfered with an active situation. That's grounds enough." Ethan scoffed. "Interfered? He was standing up for someone who was being assaulted. You're abusing your authority, and everyone knows it." Grayson's smirk faltered, but he didn't respond. Meanwhile, Xavier sat in his cell, formulating a plan. He had faced challenges like this before, moments when systemic corruption sought to silence him, but he had learned that resilience and strategy were the keys to overcoming such obstacles. A pivotal decision. By the time Ethan managed to secure Xavier's release, the crowd outside had grown into a full-blown demonstration. Supporters held signs, calling for justice, while others chanted Xavier's name. As he stepped out of the jail, the crowd erupted into cheers, their energy electrifying. Ethan approached him, his expression a mix of relief and determination. "This isn't over," he said. "They're trying to undermine you, but we won't let them." Xavier nodded, his resolve solidifying. "We need to expose what's happening here. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been silenced by this system." As the crowd continued to chant, Xavier stepped forward, raising his hands to signal for silence. When the noise died down, he spoke with the conviction of a man who had nothing to lose and everything to fight for. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about justice, about standing up against corruption and prejudice. Together, we can create a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. But it starts here, with all of us." The crowd roared in response, their energy igniting a spark within Xavier. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. The battle for Elmswood's future had reached its tipping point, and Xavier Shaw was prepared to lead the charge. The events following Xavier Shaw's arrest had sent shockwaves through Elmswood. The footage of the sheriff handcuffing him had gone viral, sparking outrage on social media and drawing the attention of civil rights groups and national news outlets. Protesters gathered outside the jail in growing numbers, their chants a mix of anger and hope. Inside his temporary cell, Xavier remained calm, his mind working like a finely tuned machine. He had been in difficult situations before, moments where the odds seemed insurmountable, but this felt different. The stakes weren't just his reputation or freedom. They were about the systemic corruption poisoning the town he was trying to uplift. He knew that this confrontation had to be more than a personal victory. It needed to spark change. As the afternoon wore on, his lawyer, Clara Reed, arrived. Clara was a force of nature, a sharp-witted attorney with an impeccable track record for taking on cases of civil rights abuses. "Xavier," she began, stepping into the dimly lit holding area, "they're trying to make an example of you." "I know," Xavier replied, his voice steady but firm. "But this is bigger than me. They're protecting a system that's been broken for decades." Clara nodded. "I've already filed for your release. There's no legitimate charge here, and Grayson knows it. But I need you to be prepared. Their aim isn't just to humiliate you, they want to discredit your entire initiative." "I won't let that happen," Xavier said. "But we need to be strategic. If we push too hard without proof, they'll twist it against us." Clara leaned closer, lowering her voice. "We might have what we need," a source reached out. "Someone inside the council. They're willing to talk, but only off the record. There's evidence of financial kickbacks involving Grady and Harris." Xavier's eyes narrowed. "They've been profiting from blocking development?" Clara nodded. "And funneling funds into projects that keep certain neighborhoods underfunded. It's deliberate segregation under the guise of fiscal responsibility." A mixture of anger and determination welled up in Xavier. This was the kind of corruption he'd suspected, but hadn't been able to prove. "We need to move fast. If we can expose this, it could turn the tide." Meanwhile, outside the jail, the crowd had grown restless. Among the protesters was Ethan Morris, who had been rallying support from local businesses and community leaders. He stood on the steps of the sheriff's office, a megaphone in hand. "This isn't just about Xavier Shaw," Ethan shouted, his voice carrying over the crowd. "This is about every person who's been silenced, every family that's been denied opportunities because of corruption and greed. We demand justice." The crowd roared in agreement, their voices echoing through the streets. Among them was Maria Diaz, a single mother who had been fighting for better funding for the local schools. She held a sign that read, "Our children deserve better." "Ethan's right," Maria called out. "We've been ignored for too long. It's time for this town to change." Inside, Sheriff Grayson watched the growing protest with a scowl. He turned to his deputy, a young officer named Mitchell, who had always seemed hesitant to follow orders. "This is getting out of hand," Grayson muttered. "We need to shut it down before it spreads." Mitchell hesitated. "They're peaceful, Sheriff. If we escalate—" "Do as you're told," Grayson snapped. "If you can't handle it, I'll find someone who can." Mitchell nodded reluctantly, his jaw tight. As he left the room, he cast a glance toward the holding area, where he knew Xavier was being kept. Something about this didn't sit right with him, but he wasn't sure what to do. By early evening, the crowd outside had swelled to over 100 people. Clara emerged from the jail, flanked by Xavier, who had finally been released. The sight of him stepping out, calm and composed, sent a wave of cheers through the protesters. Xavier raised his hand for silence, and the crowd quickly obliged. "Thank you," he began, his voice carrying over the hushed murmurs. "Thank you for standing here, for refusing to be silenced. This isn't about me. It's about justice. It's about ensuring that every voice in Elmswood is heard, not just those in power." His words ignited a renewed sense of purpose among the crowd. Ethan stepped forward, offering Xavier the megaphone. "You're not alone in this," he said. "We've got your back." As Xavier prepared to speak again, a group of officers emerged from the station, Grayson at their helm. "This is an unlawful assembly," Grayson barked, his voice amplified by his own megaphone. "Disperse immediately, or you'll all be arrested." The tension in the air was palpable. Xavier stepped forward, meeting Grayson's glare with unwavering resolve. "Sheriff, these people have a right to be here. They're exercising their First Amendment rights." Grayson sneered. "You're just stirring up trouble, Shaw. You've already done enough damage." Xavier didn't flinch. "The only damage being done here is by those who refuse to listen to their community. This town deserves better, and you know it." For a moment, it seemed as though the standoff might boil over. The crowd held its breath, watching as the two men faced off. Finally, Grayson growled, "You'll regret this." He turned and motioned for his officers to stand down, retreating back into the station. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Xavier knew this was far from over. Grayson wouldn't back down easily, and neither would the corrupt council members who had everything to lose. That night, Xavier convened a meeting with Clara, Ethan, and a few trusted allies at a nearby community center. They pored over the information provided by Clara's source, piecing together the evidence of corruption. It was damning. Bank statements, emails, and recorded conversations that tied Grady and Harris to underhanded deals. "This is the leverage we need," Clara said, tapping the pile of documents. "But we have to be careful. If they catch wind of this before we go public, they'll bury it." Ethan nodded. "We need to present this in a way that the whole town can see it, a public forum, where they can't deny it or sweep it under the rug." Xavier considered this, his mind racing. "The town hall meeting," he said finally. "It's scheduled for next week. We use that platform to reveal everything." Clara frowned. "It's risky. They'll try to shut you down." "They can try," Xavier replied, a steely determination in his voice. "But this is our best chance to expose the truth." As the meeting wrapped up, Xavier received a call from an unknown number. He answered cautiously, and a distorted voice came through the line. "Mr. Shaw, you're playing a dangerous game," the caller said. "If you value your safety, you'll drop this." The line went dead, leaving Xavier staring at the phone, his jaw tightening. The stakes had just been raised, and the fight for Elmswood's future was about to reach its breaking point. The Elmswood Town Hall was packed to capacity, the air crackling with tension. The town's residents filled the seats, their faces a mix of anticipation and apprehension. At the front of the room, Xavier Shaw stood tall, his expression composed but resolute. To his right sat Clara Reed, her briefcase of evidence carefully placed on the table in front of them. To his left was Ethan Morris, who had been instrumental in rallying community support for this moment. On the opposite side of the room sat Councilman Grady and Sheriff Grayson, flanked by their allies. Grady wore his usual smug expression, but there was a tightness in his jaw that betrayed his unease. Grayson, on the other hand, was visibly seething, his fists clenched as he avoided eye contact with Xavier. The mayor, an older man with thinning hair, tapped the microphone to signal the start of the meeting. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "Tonight's agenda is focused on addressing recent allegations and concerns raised by the community." The murmurs in the crowd quieted as all eyes turned to Xavier. He rose from his seat and walked to the podium, every step deliberate. He knew the weight of this moment, not just for himself, but for the entire town. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Good evening, Elmswood," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "For too long, this town has suffered under the weight of corruption and inequality. Tonight, we're here to shed light on the truth and demand accountability from those who have abused their power." The revelation. Xavier gestured toward Clara, who rose and began displaying copies of documents on a large screen behind them. The audience gasped as the evidence of financial misconduct was revealed. Secret payments, diverted public funds, and emails detailing backdoor deals. "These documents," Clara explained, "show a clear pattern of corruption involving Councilman Grady and Sheriff Grayson. They have used their positions to enrich themselves at the expense of the community. Funds meant for public housing and schools were rerouted into private accounts. Neighborhoods were deliberately underfunded to maintain segregation and control." The crowd erupted in whispers and gasps. Grady shot to his feet, his face red with anger. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "These so-called documents are fabrications, an obvious smear campaign by Mr. Shaw to distract from his own failures." Xavier turned to face him, his gaze unflinching. "Failures like trying to bring jobs and opportunities to this town? Or are you referring to standing up for the people you've systematically oppressed?" Grady sneered. "Don't lecture me about oppression, Shaw. You think you can waltz into this town with your money and your speeches and make everything better? You're just a businessman trying to play savior." Xavier took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "What I am, Councilman, is someone who believes this town deserves better than your lies and exploitation you've taken from the people who trusted you, and now it's time they see you for what you truly are." The crowd murmured louder, some shouting questions at Grady and Grayson. Clara raised her hand, silencing the room. "We also have a witness," she announced, "a former employee of the council who is willing to testify about the mismanagement and kickbacks." The doors at the back of the hall opened, and a man stepped in. Mitchell, the hesitant deputy who had been silently struggling with his conscience, walked to the front of the room. His face was pale, but his resolve was clear. "I worked for Sheriff Grayson," Mitchell began, his voice shaky but audible. "And I saw things I didn't agree with: funds being misused, reports being falsified, people being targeted because of who they are, not because of what they did." Grayson shot out of his seat. "You're lying!" he bellowed, his face contorted with rage. "You're just a disgruntled employee looking for attention." Mitchell turned to face him, his voice growing stronger. "I'm telling the truth, and I'm not the only one who's seen it. You think you're untouchable, but people are watching now." Grayson lunged toward Mitchell, his fury boiling over. Before he could reach him, Xavier stepped between them, his hand outstretched. "Enough!" Xavier commanded, his voice ringing through the room. "This isn't about intimidation or silencing people. It's about justice." Grayson halted, his chest heaving with rage. For a moment, it seemed as though the sheriff might lash out, but the sight of the crowd, many of whom had their phones raised, recording every second, forced him to retreat. "You've got nothing, Shaw," Grayson spat. "This town knows who I am. They'll believe me over you any day." Xavier stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "What they'll see, Sheriff, is a man who uses fear to control others, but fear isn't stronger than truth. And the truth is, your time is up." The room fell silent as Xavier turned back to the podium. He looked out over the crowd, his heart pounding, but his mind clear. "Tonight isn't just about exposing corruption," he said. "It's about deciding what kind of town we want Elmswood to be, one where power is abused and voices are silenced, or one where we stand together, demand better, and fight for what's right." The audience erupted in applause, the sound deafening. People stood, cheering and chanting Xavier's name. Even those who had been skeptical before seemed moved by his words. As the applause died down, the mayor leaned into the microphone, his expression grave. "We will review the evidence presented here tonight," he said, "and I assure you, appropriate action will be taken." But before the meeting could adjourn, a new voice rang out from the back of the room. "Mr. Shaw, you've made your point," a man called. The crowd parted, revealing a figure in a dark suit, the same unknown caller who had warned Xavier days before. The man's face was cold and calculating. "But you've underestimated how far we're willing to go to protect what's ours." Xavier met the man's gaze, his expression unyielding. "And you've underestimated how far I'm willing to go to stop you." The tension in the room reached a boiling point, leaving everyone on edge. The fight for Elmswood was far from over, and Xavier knew the battle ahead would test everything he had. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and community members, their voices blending into an indistinct roar of tension and anticipation. Xavier Shaw stood at the center of it all. His tailored suit, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene around him. Cameras flashed, microphones jutted toward him, but he ignored them, his focus razor-sharp. Inside the courthouse, a showdown awaited. Councilman Grady and Sheriff Grayson had called for an emergency hearing to address what they claimed were baseless allegations and to demand an apology from Xavier. But Xavier knew better. This wasn't about clearing their names. It was about silencing him before he could fully expose them. As he pushed through the doors, Clara Reed and Ethan Morris flanked him, their faces grim, but determined. Clara carried a leather briefcase brimming with evidence, while Ethan held his phone, ready to live stream the proceedings for the public. "Stay calm," Clara murmured as they walked down the echoing hallway. "They'll try to provoke you, make you lose your temper. Don't let them." Xavier nodded, his jaw tightening. "I didn't come this far to lose control now." The courtroom was packed, every seat taken by a mix of local officials, community members, and reporters. At the front of the room sat Councilman Grady and Sheriff Grayson, their faces masks of smug confidence. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped behind his head, while Grady whispered to his attorney, a man with a predatory glint in his eye. The judge entered, her gavel striking the room into silence. "This hearing is now in session. The matter before us pertains to allegations of corruption and misconduct within the Elmswood government. Xavier rose, stepping to the podium. His voice was steady as he began. Your Honor, this isn't just about allegations, this is about the truth, and the people of Elmswood deserve to hear it. Grady's attorney interrupted with a mocking chuckle. Objection, Your Honor. My clients are here to refute unfounded accusations, not to indulge in Mr. Shaw's theatrics. The judge raised an eyebrow. Mr. Shaw, stick to presenting your evidence. Xavier nodded, gesturing to Clara, who stood and began laying out the evidence. Screens lit up with projections of emails, financial records, and surveillance footage. The room buzzed with murmurs as the depth of the corruption was revealed. Public funds diverted to personal accounts, shady land deals that displaced low-income families, and even evidence of voter suppression tactics during the last local election. Grady's face darkened, but it was Grayson who snapped first. This is nothing but a smear campaign, he barked, rising from his seat. You think you can come in here and tarnish my reputation with doctored documents? Xavier turned to face him, his voice calm but cutting. It's not just documents, Sheriff. It's your own actions, like the time you falsified police reports to target community activists, or the time you orchestrated unlawful arrest to protect Grady's business interests. The room erupted into chaos, reporters shouting questions while the judge struggled to regain order. Clara stepped forward, her voice firm. Your Honor, we also have a witness willing to testify about the systemic corruption perpetuated by these men. The doors to the courtroom opened, and Mitchell entered, his head held high despite the tension in the air. He took the stand, his hands gripping the edge as he began to speak. I worked under Sheriff Grayson for 5 years, he said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. I saw things that went against everything law enforcement is supposed to stand for. People were targeted based on their race, their income, their willingness to stand up to the powers in this town. And I stayed quiet for too long. Grayson shot to his feet. You're a liar, he roared. You're just bitter because you were passed over for promotion. Mitchell met his gaze, unflinching. I stayed quiet because I was afraid, but not anymore. The people of this town deserve better. As Mitchell continued detailing specific incidents, the tension in the room grew palpable. Grady whispered furiously to his attorney, while Grayson's face turned a dangerous shade of red. When Mitchell finished, Xavier took the podium again. Your Honor, this isn't just about Grady and Grayson. It's about a system that's been allowed to thrive unchecked. And it's about the people in this room. People who have been silenced, ignored, and exploited. This stops today. Grady's attorney stood, his tone dripping with disdain. Your Honor, this entire proceeding is a farce. My clients have served this community for decades. This so-called evidence is circumstantial at best. Xavier stepped forward, his voice rising. Circumstantial. Then explain this. He nodded to Ethan, who played a recording on his phone. It was an audio clip of Grady and Grayson in a private meeting, laughing about their schemes. The room froze as Grady's voice echoed. Let them protest all they want. By the time they figure out what we've done, it'll be too late. Grayson's laughter followed. And if anyone gets too loud, we'll make sure they regret it. The courtroom erupted, the crowd's outrage spilling over as the judge called for order. Grady and Grayson's smug exteriors cracked, panic flashing across their faces. Where did you get that? Grady demanded, his voice trembling. Xavier didn't flinch. From someone who's tired of your lies. The judge leaned forward, her expression stern. Mr. Shaw, is this recording authentic? It is, Your Honor, Clara replied. We had it verified by an independent expert. Grady's attorney scrambled to object, but the damage was done. The tide had turned, and everyone in the room could feel it. As the judge announced a recess to review the evidence, Grady and Grayson huddled with their team. But as the crowd began to disperse, a shadow loomed at the back of the room. It was the same man who had warned Xavier before, his expression unreadable as he watched the scene unfold. Xavier caught sight of him and felt a chill run down his spine. The man tilted his head in acknowledgement, then slipped out the door without a word. What is it? Clara asked, noticing Xavier's tension. Something tells me this fight isn't over, Xavier said quietly. As the crowd buzzed with anticipation for the final decision, Xavier knew he had struck a blow, but the battle for justice in Elmswood was far from finished. The courtroom fell silent as the judge re-entered, her face stern, but calm. The tension was palpable. Every person holding their breath. Xavier Shaw sat with Clara and Ethan on either side of him, his heart pounding. He glanced toward Councilman Grady and Sheriff Grayson, whose once smug expressions had now turned to grim apprehension. The judge adjusted her glasses and began. After reviewing the evidence presented, including financial records, surveillance footage, and the authenticated audio recording, it is the court's determination that there is significant merit to the claims of corruption and misconduct against Councilman Grady and Sheriff Grayson. A collective gasp swept through the room. Xavier exhaled, but his muscles remained taut. These allegations will be formally investigated, and I am ordering that both defendants be temporarily suspended from their positions, effective immediately. The reporters burst into a flurry of whispers and camera clicks. Grady slammed his hand on the table, rising to his feet. This is outrageous. This entire hearing is a witch hunt orchestrated by an outsider. Sit down, Mr. Grady, the judge said sharply, her gavel striking twice. This court will not tolerate outbursts. As officers moved to escort Grady and Grayson from the courtroom, Grayson turned to Xavier, his voice low and venomous. You think this is over? You've just made things worse for yourself, Shaw. Xavier met his gaze without flinching. The truth always wins, Sheriff. It just takes someone willing to stand up for it. Grayson's sneer faltered as the officers led him away, his threats dissipating into the air. The courtroom began to clear, leaving Xavier and his team to gather their things. Clara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You did it, Xavier. This is the first step. Ethan grinned, holding up his phone. And the world's already watching. The live stream hit over 100,000 views, and people are flooding the comments with support. Xavier allowed himself a small smile. This fight isn't just about me, it's about everyone who's been silenced, and it's not over yet. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters had gathered, holding signs that read, Justice for Elmswood and End Corruption Now. As Xavier emerged, the crowd erupted in cheers. He raised his hand, signaling for quiet. I stand here today, not as a CEO, but as a man who believes in justice, he began. What we witnessed today is proof that change is possible when we hold those in power accountable. But this is just the beginning. We must remain vigilant, united, and committed to creating a better future for everyone in this town. The applause was thunderous. Xavier scanned the crowd, spotting familiar faces. Members of the community who had been displaced by Grady's schemes, activists who had been arrested under Grayson's orders, and even Mitchell, who stood near the back, his head held high. Mitchell approached Xavier as the crowd began to disperse. I never thought I'd see this day, he admitted. You gave me the courage to speak up. Xavier shook his hand firmly. You did the right thing, Mitchell. The people of Elmswood owe you a debt of gratitude. As the days turned into weeks, Xavier reflected on how much he had changed since arriving in Elmswood. He had come with the goal of expanding his company's operations, never expecting to find himself at the center of a battle against systemic corruption. The ordeal had tested his patience, resilience, and faith in humanity. But it had also reaffirmed his belief in the power of standing up for what was right. He had learned that true leadership wasn't just about success. It was about using your influence to uplift others and create lasting change. Clara noticed the shift in him during one of their late-night strategy sessions. You're different now, she remarked. More grounded, more unstoppable. Xavier chuckled. This fight showed me what really matters. It's not about building an empire. It's about leaving behind a legacy of integrity. The fallout from the hearing was swift. The state attorney general announced a full investigation into Elmswood's local government, and public outcry led to the resignation of several other officials complicit in Grady and Grayson's schemes. New policies were implemented to increase transparency, including independent oversight of law enforcement and stricter regulations on municipal contracts. However, the road to systemic reform was not without obstacles. Grady and Grayson's allies fought back, using their influence to spread misinformation and sow doubt about Xavier's motives. Anonymous threats began arriving at his office, but Xavier refused to back down. Instead, he worked with Clara and Ethan to form a coalition of community leaders and activists dedicated to holding the town's leadership accountable. It's going to be a long fight, Clara warned one evening as they reviewed the latest smear campaign against Xavier. I know, Xavier replied, his tone resolute. But the people of Elmswood deserve better, and I won't stop until they get it. One evening, Xavier found himself back at the diner where it had all begun. The waitress who had initially ignored him approached with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Shaw, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I treated you. I didn't realize who you were. But that's no excuse. I've been doing a lot of thinking since then." Xavier nodded, his expression kind. Acknowledging it is the first step. What matters is what you do moving forward. As she walked away, Xavier sipped his coffee, gazing out the window at the town he had come to know so intimately. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope. Not just for himself, but for the community he had grown to care about. As he left the diner, Xavier's phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "Breaking news. State announces task force to investigate corruption in rural towns. Want you to help lead it." Xavier stared at the screen, a surge of determination rising within him. He had started this journey to bring justice to Elmswood, but perhaps his impact could reach even further. He texted back, "Let's do it." Walking down the quiet street, Xavier smiled to himself. The seeds of change had been planted, and he was ready to nurture them, one step at a time. As Xavier Shaw reflected on the months that had passed since his arrival in Elmswood, he marveled at how profoundly the experience had shaped him. What began as a business expansion venture had transformed into a life-altering journey, forcing him to confront systemic corruption and racism head-on. It was a battle he hadn't anticipated, but one that he now realized had been necessary, not just for the town, but for himself. Before Elmswood, Xavier had been content to let his actions speak for themselves. He believed that building his company with integrity and giving back through philanthropy would be enough. But his time in the town had taught him that passivity, even when well-intentioned, could allow injustice to fester. Real change required not just quiet leadership, but bold action, even when it came at great personal cost. Xavier's ordeal had tested his resilience in ways he couldn't have imagined. Facing baseless accusations, public scrutiny, and the entrenched power of corrupt officials, he had been forced to draw on reserves of strength and resolve he hadn't known he possessed. But the struggle also brought out his empathy. Meeting people like Mitchell, who risked everything to speak the truth, or Clara, whose tenacity inspired him daily, reminded Xavier that courage wasn't about the absence of fear, it was about pushing forward despite it. He had learned to rely on others, to accept help, and to see collaboration as a strength rather than a concession. His most significant growth, however, lay in his ability to forgive, not in the sense of excusing wrongdoing, but in choosing not to let bitterness take root. When Sheriff Grayson had hurled his parting threats, Xavier had felt anger, but he also saw a man shackled by his own hatred. It was a powerful reminder that fighting for justice wasn't just about exposing wrongs, it was about creating systems where such hatred had no place to thrive. Xavier's struggle in Elmswood illuminated the deep and pervasive issues that plagued not just this town, but countless others like it. The corruption of leaders like Councilman Grady and Sheriff Grayson wasn't unique. It was emblematic of a system that too often allowed power to go unchecked and marginalized voices to be silenced. The people of Elmswood, like so many communities, had been told for years that their struggles were inevitable, that housing discrimination, underfunded schools, and biased policing were simply the way things were. But Xavier's fight showed them something different. That change was possible when individuals and communities united against oppression. It also highlighted the importance of accountability. Without the courage of whistleblowers like Mitchell, or the tireless work of activists like Clara, the truth might never have come to light. Xavier's experience underscored that while systemic change required policy reforms and institutional oversight, it also depended on ordinary people daring to challenge the status quo. As Xavier prepared to take on a new role as a leader of the state's task force on rural corruption, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His fight in Elmswood was just the beginning. There were countless other towns and cities where similar battles needed to be waged. He knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was no longer daunted by the enormity of the task. He wanted his story to inspire others to act, not just those in positions of power, but anyone who had ever felt the sting of injustice. Whether it was standing up to a corrupt official, supporting a neighbor in need, or simply starting a conversation about race and equity, every action mattered. Xavier believed that progress wasn't about one person changing the world. It was about many people taking small, meaningful steps together. To the people of Elmswood, Xavier's journey became a symbol of hope. His willingness to fight for justice and expose the truth resonated deeply, especially with those who had long felt powerless. Community meetings, once sparsely attended, were now vibrant forums where residents discussed how to build a more inclusive and equitable town. The mentorship programs Xavier's company sponsored brought together young people from diverse backgrounds, fostering understanding and collaboration. Of course, the fight for equity was far from over. Even with Grady and Grayson removed from their positions, the systems they had manipulated would take time to dismantle. Some residents still harbored doubts, questioning whether real change could take root in a place so long defined by corruption. Xavier understood their skepticism, but he also saw the progress they had already made. The seeds of change had been planted, and while it would take time and effort to nurture them, he believed in the community's ability to grow. Elmswood had already shown that when people came together, they could achieve the unthinkable. As he walked through the town one crisp autumn morning, Xavier saw tangible signs of that growth. A once-abandoned community center had been revitalized into a bustling hub for after-school programs and local events. The diner, now under new management, proudly displayed a sign in its window, "Everyone welcome." And at the edge of the park, a mural painted by local artists depicted a diverse group of hands holding up a torch, symbolizing unity and resilience. Standing before the mural, Xavier was joined by Clara and Ethan, who had become his closest allies throughout the ordeal. They gazed at the artwork, its vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray clouds that had loomed over Elmswood just months ago. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly, "and it's because of you." Xavier shook his head, his voice filled with humility. "It's because of us. All of us. Change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens when people come together, when they refuse to accept the world as it is and work to build something better." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the mural in a warm golden glow, Xavier felt a profound sense of hope. He thought of the countless voices that had risen alongside his own, the lives that had been touched by their collective efforts, and the future they were all working toward. He knew the journey ahead would be challenging, but he also knew it would be worth it. For every obstacle, there would be a breakthrough. For every moment of despair, there would be a spark of inspiration. And for every injustice, there would be people willing to stand up and fight back. This was the legacy Xavier wanted to leave, not just in Elmswood, but everywhere his story reached. A legacy of courage, unity, and unwavering belief in the power of humanity to overcome even the deepest divides. As he turned to leave, Xavier whispered to himself, a promise that would guide him in the days and years to come. "This is only the beginning."